In the middle of the 15th century, Central and Southern Africa is still unknown to Europe. However, for centuries, the Arabs operated trade routes crossing the vast Sahara Desert, transporting to the Mediterranean gold, ivory, and slaves.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we already see some globalization in the 15th century. So we do see some connections, but we don't see a direct connection with the Europeans and Africans. We see Arabs as middlemen, but we see some very valuable commodities, gold, ivory, and slaves, being exported to Europe. But as we know, Europeans in the mid-15th century, they're very focused on getting to India. They want to get to the Indian Ocean, they want to get to the monsoon marketplace, as John Green called it, they want to get to China. So they're going to overlook the continent to some extent, as their focus is on Asia, not Africa, in the 15th century.
Europe is more interested in profitable trade routes from Asia, especially the import of silk and spices. But the expansion of the Ottoman Empire threatens these networks. Furthermore, the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula set their sights on discovering new sea routes to Asia to corner the lucrative markets.
So we have the Iberian Peninsula, we have the Portuguese and the Spanish trying to find their way to Asia. They're trying to find their way east by going south. And that's why we have the Portuguese especially getting a jump start on creating colonies in Africa. And some Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama being some of the first to be able to travel around Africa. But at the same time, one of the reasons why globalization is coming to Africa is the Ottomans are going to get in the way. So the Europeans are trying to get to Asia, but there's this growing power, the Ottoman Empire, that is going to start controlling much of the Middle East. So rather than funneling through the Middle East, they're going to have to go around the Ottomans, and therefore that's going to bring them into contact with Africa, or as Columbus finds out, with America.
Furthermore, the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula set their sights on discovering new sea routes to Asia to corner the lucrative markets. Portugal takes the lead by inventing the caravel, a lightweight, versatile vessel allowing it to accelerate exploration of the African coast. The country establishes maritime trading posts as an alternative to overland trade routes, especially to capture the highly profitable slave trade. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reaches India. Portugal rapidly grows in power in the Indian Ocean and dominates the spice trade.
All right, so if you're Spain, if you're France, if you're England, if you're the Netherlands, if you're Italy doesn't exist, but if you're some of the Italian city-states like Venice, you're watching Portugal, and because of the zero-sum theory, because of realism, because of power struggle, you need to react. Your rival is becoming stronger. So you need to emulate them. You need to become innovative and maybe become better at what they're doing than they're doing. So the Portuguese, they're really starting a race of exploration, a race of colonization. And late to the race will be the Spanish, some of the Italian city-states, the Dutch, and the French and the British. And really late will be the Germans. So we see the Portuguese becoming quite wealthy because of their possessions in Africa, and others are going to need to also explore and colonize. Otherwise, relative to Portugal, they're beginning to become weaker. And the fear is, if Portugal becomes too strong relative to them, then Portugal will subjugate them. They don't want to be subject to the power of Portugal. They want to see their power expand. So we're still seeing the whole conflict of power. We're still seeing realism here. So in the game between Europeans, the Africans are suffering.
The country grows rich and faces no competition from the Spanish Empire as the two reach an agreement to define their zones of influence as per the Treaty of Tordesillas.
So the Spanish and the Portuguese have a treaty. That's why you have Brazil, which is Portuguese, but the rest of the Americas are quite influenced by Spain, because there's a treaty defining which parts of the world, which sphere of influence is Portugal's, and which is Spain's. So this is why Portugal is able to, along the coast, be able to have a lot of colonies without worrying about the rivalry of Spain. You can see that at this time, Spain has control over over Italy, and over some of the, what is now the Netherlands. So that's why there's Spanish steps in Rome. You should go to the Spanish steps in Rome. Just watch your wallet.
Spain therefore focuses on the American continent. In 1580, the King of Spain takes control of Portugal to form the Iberian Union. The new maritime power, the Netherlands, takes advantage of the situation to seize Portuguese colonies. Portugal finally regains its independence and tries to regain control of businesses in Africa. But the country now faces competition from new European powers settling along the African coast. The situation then remains relatively stable for centuries, with each country managing its own trade routes. Slave trade becomes the most profitable business. European ships buy slaves in Africa, whom they exchange in America for gold and local products such as sugar and coffee.
And we've seen the triangle trade in the textbook, and we talked about the slave trade. And the textbook also talks about mercantilism, this idea of the Europeans trying to create exclusive trade zones. So mercantilism is significantly different than globalization today, in the sense that in the global economy today, we try to practice free trade, so that not just one country, but most or hopefully all countries can access the resources, including the consumers of different countries. So if we can all access the resources and consumers of other countries, theoretically, there's no reason to go to war over economics. But mercantilism is different. Under mercantilism, you try to create a colony that's your exclusive colony. So the people of that colony can only trade with the motherland. This exclusive nature of economics will be one of the leading factors driving the American colonies into revolution. Because those in Jamestown, in Virginia, they are exclusively tied to England, even if they could get a better trade relationship with a country like France. But because they can only sell their products, tobacco, to one country, the price that they're able to get is artificially low. So mercantilism is meant to fuel the mother country, to feed the mother country at the expense of the colonies, because it's an exclusive economic trading relationship. So in Canada, we had mercantilism under the Hudson Bay Company, under the Northwest Company. So lands that the waters flowed and drained into the Hudson Bay, the fur trade of that area, it was exclusive to the Hudson Bay Company. So if you're a fur trader in that area, you could only trade your product with one company. So if you can only sell your thing, a beaver pelt, to one company, that company is going to give you an artificially low price because there's no competition. So in 1776, Adam Smith is going to write a book called The Wealth of Nations, and he's going to say mercantilism is actually artificially keeping our economies smaller than they could be if we had, freedom to trade. But I just want to interrupt this for a second, because what we're seeing here is mercantilism. All these exclusive colonies, Denmark got a colony, Great Britain's got some colonies, and these colonies only do trade with their mother country. That's mercantilism.
From the mid-18th century, anti-slavery movements gain momentum in Europe and gradually lead to a fall in human trafficking and slavery. In the US, a project to repatriate freed slaves to Africa gets underway. A colony is established, allowing the return of thousands of former slaves. Although there are conflicts with indigenous populations, Liberia becomes independent in 1847. A few years later, France and Egypt inaugurate the Suez Canal, opening a new, shorter sea route to Asia. In the African colonies, interest turns towards trying to gain arable land in order to grow agricultural products primarily for European markets. While exploring the land, colonists discover the continent is rich in resources, stirring the appetite of European powers in the midst of industrial development.
So that's also key, in the midst of industrial development. So one of the main commodities that people are beginning to consume in Europe would be things like bicycles and eventually automobiles. And for both of those, you need rubber for the tires. Not a lot of rubber trees in Europe due to climate. But eventually, when maybe you notice that there's an area in here that was clouded that got smaller and smaller, eventually when that area was discovered, they discovered rubber. And there's a great demand for rubber back in Europe, so there's going to be a race by Europeans to try to colonize these areas so that they can extract the very valuable rubber that is needed for industrialization back in Europe. So economics is driving globalization. We need a commodity, rubber, that we can't get back in Europe. And we want to get it, and we don't want our rivals to get it. So we want exclusive power over the rubber of the Congo region of Africa. So you're going to get European powers like Belgium creating colonies there. And we'll see how that goes.
Tensions flare because of competition between European nations. In 1884, a conference is held in Berlin to regulate colonization. King Leopold II of Belgium gets personal possession of a large, little-known area in the heart of the continent.
So it's not even, you notice it doesn't say Belgium, it says Leopold. That's his territory. He owns this. And Leopold will end up ordering a genocide of about 10 million Congolese people there, as he ends up doing some of those things we accredited to Columbus, like cutting off hands to resistors. Because he needs to extract that rubber as fast as possible, and he ends up committing genocide to those who resist. So, the Congress of Berlin in 1884 is noteworthy, or worth noting, sorry. And at it, they try to, because wars are starting, or battles are starting to happen between European powers competing for territories in Africa, at the Congress of Berlin in 1884, they try to carve Africa in a more diplomatic way. But interesting to note, there are no Africans at the conference. It's Europeans sitting, looking at a map of Africa, saying, yeah, we want this area, we want this area. Noticeable by their absence is the Africans, and this is just another version of ethnocentrism. So Europeans will come to Africa looking for gold, God, and glory. And let's see how that story goes.
Germany, Spain and Italy seize territories, while the UK receives Egypt. Henceforth, countries can stake claim to any land they physically occupy. European nations, boosted by their superior military technology, engage in a race for control of the largest possible territory at the expense of local kingdoms and empires.
You can see that the British section is growing south, and growing south here, growing north here, and then they end up getting an idea. It's like, you know what, we could link these two massive landholdings of ours. So there's going to be, in England, there's going to be a desire for a Cairo to Cape Town railway. Let's build a railway, an axis from north to south in Africa, so that we can better build infrastructure, yes, but better extract those resources that we're getting from Africa. So the British tried to build a Cairo to Cape Town railway. At this point in the 19th century, in fact, the British Empire is the only empire that makes money from Africa. The others, the French in Northwest Africa, the Germans with their scattering of holdings, the Portuguese, these colonies start losing money. It costs more money to occupy them and to build infrastructure than the amount of wealth that you're leaving. We're going to leave Leopold's territory out of it because that's not really a national holding, that's a private holding. It's kind of like Mark Zuckerberg owning a country. You know, this is Zuckerberg's territory.
In most cases, land is stolen and redistributed to European settlers. Indigenous people are subject to taxes but have no money to pay them, so they find themselves working in the fields or in mines, which become a form of forced labor.
So, should we reflect or reject globalization? Well, to the indigenous peoples of Africa, we should reject it, because to them, globalization has meant servitude, that they have seen their land stolen, then they're forced to work to pay taxes that are now being put upon them by European powers. To them, globalization's a horrible system. We don't want to connect with others. Globalization, the interconnectedness of mankind, they look at it and say, oh man, we do that, bad things happen. So, some will resist.
Italy, which controls Eritrea and Somalia, fails to conquer the empire of Abyssinia, which gains international recognition as a sovereign nation. After the discovery of diamonds and gold in the south of the continent, the British Empire expands to take over the states of Transvaal and Orange.
Pretty weird, eh? It's like, hey, you know what? We have no interest in those territories. Wait, what? You found gold and diamonds? We want those territories now. So what is fueling? Greed is fueling it, right? The British had no interest in those two territories until they found valuable resources there. And then they're like, yeah, you know what? We want those territories. It's all about realism. It's all about the conquest of power. What is power? In this time, power is defined as valuable resources like gold and diamonds. And we can't allow another power to have it, because then, relative to them, we're losing power.
Diamonds and gold in the south of the continent, the British Empire expands to take over the states of Transvaal and Orange, both of which were founded by the Boers.
And Canadians will go and fight on behalf of the British in the Boer War at the turn of the 20th century.
Mainly descendants of Dutch settlers who fled following the arrival of the British. In 1908,
So this is where we fight the Dutch.
King Leopold II cedes Congo to Belgium. 2 years later, after long negotiations, southern British colonies of the continent gain independence, forming the Union of South Africa. The new country remains linked to the British Empire by becoming a dominion, ceding certain powers to the British Crown.
Similar to Canada was once a dominion of Canada.
During World War I, hundreds of thousands of men from the colonies are sent to European and African front lines. The United Kingdom, France, Belgium and South Africa take over the German colonies. At the end of the war, a separatist revolution breaks out in Egypt. The UK is forced to recognize the end of its protectorate status, but the country retains control of the Suez Canal by maintaining a military presence. In 1935, fascist Italy again tries to conquer Abyssinia. This time, the Italian army is successful in gradually seizing territories, but Abyssinia would never sign an armistice. World War II breaks out in Europe, and again, hundreds of thousands of Africans are involved in fighting on different fronts. Italy, allied with Nazi Germany, loses its colonies on the continent. At the end of World War II, Abyssinia becomes Ethiopia and regains its sovereignty. Talks are held at the United Nations to discuss the future of other Italian colonies. With European nations weakened by war, the United States leans in. Fearing the rise of the Soviet Union and communism in the world, the country supports the independence of colonies and their admission to the United Nations. When an insurrection breaks out in Madagascar against French occupiers, it is brutally suppressed. Italy eventually gets control of Somalia for another 10 years, while Libya becomes independent. Kenya also begins an anti-colonial uprising that would last 8 years and result in many civilian victims. In 1952, the Egyptian army overthrows the monarchy and begins anti-colonial policies. On the one hand, the country makes contact with the Soviet Union to provide arms. On the other, it provides military support to aid Algerian nationalists against the French occupation. Egypt also claims control of Sudan and nationalizes the Suez Canal, chasing away the French and the British. In response, they combine with Israel to organize a surprise attack on Egypt. The offensive is a success.
The good news, you don't need to memorize each one of these skirmishes and battles and campaigns for independence, but we do need you to know one term, and that's decolonization. So we saw colonization. That's when Africa is divided and controlled by mostly European powers. Now we're seeing decolonization, DE colonization, all one word, and this just simply means independence movements. So countries like Kenya saying we don't want to be part of the British Empire anymore. Countries like South Africa saying we want to be independent of the British Empire. Egypt and Libya, and we'll see eventually decolonization will spread to all of Africa.
But is stopped after the USSR's threat of nuclear war. The US then steps in and orders an end to the offensive. The event marks the end of the British and French domination on the continent. Aware of losing their grip on power, France and the UK try to moderate their policy and maintain influence on the continent. Britain supports the independence of Sudan to prevent the country coming under Egyptian control. The same year, France, which is mired in war in Algeria, recognizes the independence of Morocco and Tunisia to avoid the spread of violence. The UK is ready to recognize the independence of its colonies, in some cases if the new governments join the Commonwealth, an intergovernmental organization headed by the British Crown. France, for its part, tries to set up a Franco-African community. All colonies accept the proposal with the exception of Guinea, which then gains independence. In 1960, a new wave of colonies gaining independence ends this project. France withdraws but maintains economic control over the region with the CFA franc currencies. The same year, the Belgian Congo also gets independence and becomes the Congo Leopoldville. France tries to maintain control over Algeria at all costs. But violent repression and massacres of local populations make them lose support of the French people and the international community. Despite violence committed by some of its own forces, Algerian separatists take the advantage by playing the diplomatic card and gaining debates in the UN. France, defensive at first, tries the empty chair policy and in 1962 finds itself forced to recognize the independence of Algeria. South of the continent, while the British lose their last colonies, Portugal also finds itself in trouble. Despite large investments and significant migrations of Portuguese to Angola, war breaks out and spreads into other colonies, causing the country to invest heavily in military efforts. Finally, a revolution in Portugal overthrows the regime. The new government recognizes the independence of the colonies and organizes emergency repatriation of its settlers.
So for the most part, this decolonization isn't clean. It's bloody, it's messy, there's wars, there's massacres, there's people fleeing, there's refugees. So what has Europe done? What is the legacy of globalization? We've plundered the resources and we've destabilized the continent.
To the north, Morocco pressures Spain to quit the Western Sahara. When the Spanish finally depart, it captures 2/3 of the liberated country. While European nations are no longer present in Africa, southern Rhodesia is the only country whose independence was obtained by British colonists who hoped to themselves found a country ruled by white people. The country is not recognized in the UN and comes under great international pressure. In 1980, it yields, and a transitional government is set up to form Zimbabwe. Despite the end of European presence in Africa, the continent will still have to face various forms of neocolonialism. World power.
The neocolonialism is like a new wave of colonialism happening today in the 21st century. Africa in 2020 is being colonized again, but not directly, but indirectly, colonized by both American and increasingly Chinese interests. You go to Africa, and to some extent you should go to Africa. When you go to Africa, you can see this competition between between the Americans and the Chinese for the hearts and minds of the Africans. That both the Americans and the Chinese are investing heavily in places in Africa to try to buy allies. One other player in Africa would be the Saudis and Arabs in places like Somalia and places like the Sudan, where the Arabs have invested heavily into attempting to have some anti-American allies. So that's one way to look at colonization in Africa. We have a second video, and then you'll be free of listening to me today. That is here. Why imperialism in the 19th century? So why then? This time, I'm gonna pause it. I'm gonna keep recording with it, but I don't think I'm gonna need to pause it as much because this narrator goes quite slow, and I think a lot of it is a recap of stuff you've already seen now.
Hey guys, today we're going to begin talking about 19th century imperialism. And by 19th century, I really mean like the later half of the 19th century and the first little bit of the 20th century. That is the era of like modern industrial imperialism. Here are your goals. We'll talk about these tomorrow in class, but this is what you should be thinking about as you watch the video. Alright, so let's get started with a little bit of background info and terminology. So what do we mean when we say imperialism? Well, basically, imperialism is when a country pursues the goal of establishing, expanding, and or maintaining an empire.
So some of the visuals you'll see later today, some of the cartoons, some of the sources, when you look in them, you'll see globalization. But much like the ones on the slave trade, you look in, you see globalization, but more specifically, you see the slave trade. So the slave trade is connected to globalization. Today, you're going to be looking at sources, and you're going to look in, you're going to see globalization, but more specifically, you're going to see imperialism. So imperialism is simply the domination of one country by another. Domination of one country by another. That's imperialism.
But then that leads us to the question, well, what is an empire? And an empire is a political entity, like a country or a state, in which a single dominant region uses its power to control a number of other regions with the goal of further strengthening the dominant region. So let's break that down. First, let's look at some examples. So we've talked about in the past the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Spanish Empire. These were all empires. And what they all had in common was that each of these had a central region. This region was like the most powerful and the richest part of the empire. So let's just look at Rome, for example. So Rome in Italy was really powerful, and it used its power to go out and conquer its neighbors. It conquered France, it conquered Greece, it conquered North Africa, and it brought all of those together into an empire and used those regions to make itself stronger. It took resources, it took people, it took taxes from those regions and made itself stronger. This happens in Spain when they conquer the New World, and we're going to see it happen again in the 19th century with a bunch more countries. And so, remember, there are 3 rules for building an empire. If you want to build an empire, this is what you do. 1, you use your power to conquer a weaker territory. So you go over and you take over a weak neighbor or some weak person maybe on the other side of the ocean. 2nd, you take stuff from the conquered territories. This could be tax money, this could be natural resources, or it could even be people. But you take these people or these things from that territory. And 3, you use the stuff or the people that you take in order to increase your control of the conquered territories, or to go on to conquer even more territories. So you conquer an area, you take stuff, and you use that stuff to make yourself even more powerful. 1, 2, 3, those are the steps for building.
And those 3 steps, each step you should be saying, oh man, this is social Darwinism, this is the law of the jungle, this is might is right, this is realism, this is the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, this is the essay, and this is that reoccurring topic that we've been talking about all month so far.
An empire. Let's look at 19th century imperialism. So basically, from a time period starting roughly around 1850, going back a little bit earlier if you want to talk about Great Britain, and going up until 1914, the industrializing nations of the world were able to incorporate much of the rest of the world into these huge global empires. And there were a couple major players and then a couple more minor players that you should know about. The major players in this were Britain, France, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the United States. These were the big, powerful, industrializing regions of the world, and they were able to go out and to build huge empires around the world. There were also some smaller players. These were lesser industrial powers, and these included places like Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and the Netherlands. And historians, some historians at least, call this new period from around 1850 to 1914 an era of new imperialism.
So we saw today that during old imperialism, Portugal got the jump start on Africa. During old imperialism, the Dutch had, a significant presence in the Far East. And the Dutch had colonies, even in North America, New Amsterdam, which becomes New York. But new imperialism is fueled by the Industrial Revolution. And some countries, England, go through the Industrial Revolution before others. So because the British are the first to industrialize, they have a mechanized military, an industrialized military, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, that they can go use to subjugate indigenous peoples globally.
Some people debate whether this style of imperialism is really quite new, but what some people talk about for this time period is that empires go from being kind of like regional empires, think of like the Roman Empire was just for the Mediterranean, or they go from being like a scattered system of trading posts into these like continent-wide, ocean-crossing, worldwide empires. So it's kind of like you take imperialism to the next level once you get to the middle of the 19th.
And the best example is the British, and there'll be many ways to describe it, but a couple that really kind of resonate with me would be that the sun never set on the British Empire. So the British would say, the sun never sets on us. We have interests in all of the time zones of the world. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That's the glory of the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. And then for the Germans, they look at that, and in 1914 they're like, well, we want our place in the sun. Who are the British? They're the Anglos, they're the Saxons, both Germanic tribes that couldn't compete against the other Germanic tribes of Europe, so they fled the continent. And they ended up, creating their nation in what is currently the United Kingdom. So how are these Anglo and Saxons, they're Germanic, but they're inferior to those Germanic tribes that remained on the continent, how have they created an empire that is global and we haven't? We want our place in the sun, and the German desire for their place in the sun will, as you will see next year, help create World War I.
Century. And that's why some people call this new imperialism. And just as this imperialism was wide-reaching and more intense than earlier forms of imperialism, it also had more intense, more wide-reaching consequences that we're going to talk about later. There's a picture here of the British Empire, which is the quintessential 19th century empire. And it actually was the largest empire ever, with the exception of the Mongols. And everything you see there in red was part of the British Empire. And we'll talk about them more later. So here's a map of the world in 1914, and it shows the
Just some quick good news. You don't have to color a map for me. You don't have to label a map for me. That's not going to be on the test. This isn't Social 7 or 8, where I just want to kill some time and get you coloring. You maybe missed the coloring aspect of social studies. And I apologize if you do, but that's not higher mental activity. That's coloring. And that's just very, very simple transfer of information. So rather than having a test where we ask you to identify these things, we're going to ask you to make some conclusions about imperialism, connecting it to globalization, connecting it to ideological perspectives. So don't memorize the map, is what I'm saying. Because that could be a lot of time to do that, and it wouldn't be time well invested.
into maybe like 10 different global empires, and that was how the world worked. So you were seeing more bigger empires in the 19th century than you've ever seen before in world history. And now a good question is, why does that happen?
So one of the big connections here, why is there new imperialism, is because of the Industrial Revolution. Because of the Industrial Revolution, finally Europeans have the means to subjugate the Africans. They've known about the Africans for thousands of years. They've never really been able to get into the heart of darkness. They've never really been able to get into what will become the Congo. They don't have the ability to go there. They don't have the boats. They don't have the guns. They lose the battles against tribes like the Zulu. But now that they are industrialized, they can go to war with the Zulu and win. So finally, now the Europeans are the strong. Had they tried this in the 13th century, they would have lost, because they didn't have the means.
Well, a major cause of this new wave of imperialism was industrialization. And we can get a hint that this is the case from the fact that all of the major empires of the 19th century were centered on industrializing nations. So an industrial nation always stood at the core of these new global empires. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, industrialization makes it easier to set up an empire because it makes a nation more powerful. And remember, the first step in setting up an empire is using your power to take over somebody else. So if you become more powerful, there are going to be more opportunities for imperialism. And industrialization makes a country more powerful in a number of ways. But basically you get more people because of more efficient agriculture, you get better technology, steamships, machine guns, advanced medicines, and you also just get more stuff because you're using machines to create stuff and you're using steam power to make those machines go. So there's more stuff, better stuff, and more people to use the stuff, and this makes your nation more powerful. Also, another reason that industrialization leads to empire is that industry demands natural resources. Basically, for all the stuff you're getting out of your factories, you need stuff to put into your factories. And this means you're going to need more and more stuff as industrialization continues. And think about how tiny England is. England's a tiny little island, but if it's going to keep growing industrially, it's going to need to bring in resources from outside.
So England's strong, but based upon domestic resources, they have reached their potential. They can't get any stronger. And in a thirst for more power, they need to go and find resources elsewhere. They need to go to Europe. They need to go to Africa. They need to go to Asia. So again, this fits with realism, this fits with natural selection, this fits with the strong feed on the weak. That if you stop feeding on someone else, you become the weak. So they need to go, the English do, and others do, they need to go to Africa, because Africa is a treasure chest of resources.
It's going to need to bring in extra food, it's going to need to bring in cotton to make cloth, it's going to need to bring in rare metals to make more advanced machines and stuff like that. And English resources are only going to go so far, so they're going to eventually have to look to other places to get this stuff. And what Britain does to secure its imports of these important resources is they set up colonies in order to secure those resources, and then they can import them into Britain. So imperialism is a way for industrial nations to bring in the natural resources that they need. And 3, industrial nations also need places to sell their products. As industrialization goes on, you are making more and more stuff. But for all the stuff you make, you also need more people to sell to.
So one of the things we'll see in India, when we get to India on Monday, is that the British need to sell their textiles. The first breakthrough industry in the Industrial Revolution in England was textiles, clothing and textiles, creating clothes. And there's a pocket of consumers in England, but there's a lot more people in India. So if we can sell our product back to the Indian people, then our potential revenue, our potential profit will grow because our market will grow. So for the British, this is a true example of mercantilism. You take the indigo from India, you bring it back to Manchester and Leeds in England, where it's processed into clothing and textiles, then you sell the clothes back to India. So not only are you getting the resources from them, you're fueling jobs back home in England in the factories, and then you are making money by selling them clothes. So in the movie Gandhi, we're going to see that Gandhi at one point will have a protest against mercantilism, and he's going to ask his Indian brothers and sisters to burn the foreign clothes from Manchester and Leeds and to wear homespun. Homespun is clothes made by Indians for Indians. That's a protest against globalization.
And because there's only a limited number of people in any given country, at a certain point you're going to need to start selling to other people. And what industrialized nations started to do in the second half of the 19th century was to claim other areas and to sell their stuff in those areas. So for example, Britain claimed India and then basically just started selling British cloth to India and made a huge profit in doing so.
And Britain claimed parts of China and said, hey China, you're buying opium.
Another cause for imperialism in the 1800s were a lot of different cultural ideas.
So now we're going to hear about social Darwinism, we're going to hear about natural selection, we're going to hear about white man's burden and ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism. So, Darwin is active in the 19th century, traveling with some of those explorers, going to islands like the Galapagos, and he's creating some amazing studies in biology about evolution. But others will take Darwin's findings from the animal kingdom and apply it to mankind. Darwin doesn't come up with social Darwinism. Others will take his observations about animals and try to extend it to mankind and say that just like some birds have evolved differently because of their environments, mankind has evolved differently because of their environments. So on the Galapagos Islands, you have some flightless birds. They're the blue-footed boobies, for example, that they wouldn't be able to exist in Canada because coyotes would eat them, right? So they have not evolved to be strong as Canadian birds have had to evolve to be strong. Canadian geese are strong. If you don't believe me, go approach a Canada goose and see it attack you. Canada geese are ferocious. So, long story short, Darwin looks at the animal kingdom and says animals have been forced to evolve if they're in a situation of competition and danger, or they happen to evolve. They're quite, maybe even if you remove them, they'd be quite vulnerable. But in their environment, like the Galapagos, where there's not a lot of natural predators, they might not have those defensive mechanisms like wings. So others will say, you know what, this has happened for Europeans. Because Europeans had to compete with each other, it was cold, Europeans are stronger. Because Africans had things good, warmer climate, there was more space, they weren't in direct competition with each other, they're inferior. And they even went so far as suggesting that Africans were closer to other ape-like animals, like chimpanzees and gorillas, than they were with humans. And because they were more ape-like, then it was the right thing to do, which would be to parent them. So this comes into the cultural bias that is ethnocentrism and that paternalism, this idea that I need to care for you because you're incapable of caring for yourself, and it is riddled with racism.
And one of the most disturbing cultural ideas that led to imperialism was this belief in industrialized nations that they were culturally or racially superior to the people who lived in other parts of the world. Industrialized countries tended to think that they were more advanced than non-industrialized regions, and technologically this was true. They had more advanced technology, but they started to also think that they were more advanced as people, like genetically more advanced. And they used this idea that it was to argue that it was okay to conquer these other regions because they were more advanced. They had the duty to take over the less advanced parts of the world and to raise up the less advanced peoples to civilization. So this was an idea that made it seem okay that Europe and America were taking over the rest of the world. There was also widespread racist thought back then based on pseudoscientific ideas. And basically these guys argued that Europeans were destined to rule the world because they were, quote, the most advanced race. And some scientists even used new ideas, Darwin's new ideas of evolution, to argue that Europeans were more highly evolved than other races, and that because of this, it was only natural that Europeans would go on to dominate the world because of natural selection. This, of course, has nothing to do with Darwin's theories, but the idea was very popular back in the imperial time periods. There was also nationalistic competition. Basically, different industrial countries were racing to claim as much land as possible because they were worried that other nations would claim it if they didn't get to it first. And finally, they also wanted to distract the poor masses who lived in their cities. So the poor working class peoples were suffering a lot during this time period.
Hey, it sucks living in Manchester and Leeds. There's lots of poverty, but let's look at the glory of the empire, right? It's a distraction. So that's a great point. Why have an empire? Why do we need to go and subjugate others? Because life's not great at home for everyone. So we need something to unite our people in glory.
But they were often distracted and impressed by imperial adventures, right? So if your country won like a great battle or conquered a whole big chunk of territory, you would be happy and you would tend to like the government. So governments could use nationalism, or could use imperialism to distract their workers and their masses in order to prevent revolution and to increase their own popularity. So sometimes governments pursued imperialism even when it didn't make sense, just because it was popular at home.
Alright, so I have one final story to tell you about 19th century imperialism, and then you'll get an opportunity to do the reading. I want to talk to you about Dr. Livingston. So Dr. Livingston was a medical doctor, but also a Christian missionary who traveled to Africa and adventured into the parts of Africa that in the mid-19th century no Europeans had been to before. And he was writing letters, and his letters would be released in the newspapers around the world. So he became a global celebrity. People kept waiting for these letters because they wanted to hear about what he was finding. It'd be like if someone was going to Mars and telling us about all these stories about Martian culture that they were finding, because he was encountering people that had been unencountered, right, by Europeans or Americans or Asians before. So he was literally the first person reporting back. So it was very fascinating. But then the letters stopped coming. And people didn't know, well, what happened to Dr. Livingston? So there's a gentleman, David Stanley, that said, I'll go look for him. I'm going to go find this guy. But he needed someone to sponsor him. So he asked many different companies and individuals to sponsor him. And ultimately, guess who sponsors him? King Leopold of Belgium. He says, I will pay your way, but you need to report back to me about anything of value that you're seeing. So when David Stanley goes to find Dr. Livingstone's there to do medicine. He's there to help the people of Africa. Dr. Livingstone so loves Africa that when he dies, he's going to have his heart buried in Africa. His body will be sent home, but his heart remains in Africa today. He fell in love with the continent and the people. So he was there, Dr. Livingstone, to tend to the African people, to deliver them medicine, to learn from them, and to spread the light of Christ. But when David Stanley comes looking for him, David Stanley's reporting back to King Leopold, oh man, there's rubber here, there's lots of cool things, these are the ways we can control and basically destroy the cultures here so that we can end up taking ownership. So indirectly, Livingstone's missionary work will lead to the scramble for Africa. And it ends up coming to this famous line when Stanley does eventually find Livingstone. He comes up to him and says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And that became like a line that people used to say to each other in parties. And the story is that when Stanley eventually finds Livingstone, he knew it was Livingstone because it was the only other white guy. It was like, hey, I haven't seen a white guy in weeks. You got to be the doctor. So he found him in the middle of what becomes the Congo. And unfortunately, this man who's there out of kindness and compassion and empathy for his fellow man ends up fueling millions of people being controlled and exploited and murdered. All right, so that's the end of the lesson. I'll give you some time before a break to do the readings. I'll give you some time after the break to do the readings. And after lunch, we'll look at those sources.